we are trying to give customers a tool that is flexible enough to do anything they want, that is customizable enough to do anything they want, but at the same time, it's allowing you to do this in a very quick time.
Hi, welcome to JavaScript Jam. I am Ishan, co-founder and CTO at Layer Zero, and with me is Mark Brocado. Mark, you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Mark Brocado, Vice President of Engineering at Layer Zero.
And today we welcome Filip Rakowski, who is the co-founder and CTO of Vue Storefront, the lightning-fast front-end platform for e-commerce. Filip, why don't you say hello?
Hey, hello.
Well, why don't we get started? Just tell us about yourself, where you're calling in from, and a little bit about your background. And then we can get into Vue Storefront.
Yeah, so I think I started coding when I was 13, something like this, and I started with the standard stuff, websites about cats, stuff like this. But when I was 16, I started doing this professionally. My first websites were actually also the very simple websites, but the first e-commerce websites I have built were on WooCommerce. And I was a WooCommerce freelancer for a couple of years until I got bored because the projects were very repetitive. Of course, there is kind of beauty in it because once you make a certain amount of projects in WooCommerce, you are able to do crazy things in a very, very short time. So that was super cool. But at some point, I just got bored. So I thought, okay, it's time to do something serious. It's time to join some e-commerce agency. And this is how I joined Devante, where I was working for more than 3 years. And in Devante, the first thing actually the first technology I worked with was Magento. And being completely honest, it wasn't what I was expecting. So I was expecting, this really serious e-commerce development. And the reality was, it was a serious e-commerce development, but it was taking so much time to develop a very basic features. It was so complicated. And, when I was originating from WooCommerce, where I was actually to drag and drop most of the things and code maybe just few of them. So it was completely not what I was expecting. And that was also one of the reasons why actually we have created Vue Storefront, because it was not only me who was frustrated. Actually, most of the front-end developers, they didn't like Magento that much, because if you're a front-end developer and if you're a Magento front-end developer, these are completely different worlds. So if you're a Magento front-end developer, basically dealing with XMLs, a little bit of JavaScript, but mostly outdated technologies. So in Magento 1, it was prototype.js. In Magento 2, it's knockout.js. So very old technologies are not very widely used actually anywhere.
That's fascinating. I remember Knockout. Now you're making me feel old. I thought Knockout was the jam back in the day. Yeah. So that's a good segue into Vue Storefront. So give us an intro for folks that don't know Vue Storefront. What is it? Why should developers pick it? What are some of the benefits?
Yeah, so in short words, Vue Storefront is basically a front end for e-commerce. So right now we have this huge paradigm shift into headless e-commerce, into composable commerce. So we have all these APIs, but all these APIs need a front end. So Vue Storefront is this front end. But building front ends is becoming more and more complex over time. Like when you were building a headless front ends 5-6 years ago, you're basically taking the JSON from the API, displaying the results, sometimes posting something, and that's it. Right now, they're as complex as the backend applications. And our customers also see this. This is why there's new category on the market, like this headless frontends or bodiless frontends, basically, and because we are the head, and we are trying to give customers a tool that is flexible enough to do anything they want, that is customizable enough to do anything they want, but at the same time, it's allowing you to do this in a very quick time. So that's, I think, the main issue right now with a headless commerce. So whenever our clients or whenever anyone is choosing this set of headless technologies, they have to spend so much time on orchestrating all of that on the front-end layer. So we are providing them out-of-the-box integrations, boilerplates, best practices, and like the architecture that is kind of like enforcing some of the good practices to make sure that it's fairly easy for them to make those front ends, but also that this front ends will remain scalable and that this front ends will remain flexible, because that's actually what headless is all about, right?
And I think we should mention Vue Storefront is open source.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys just recently announced backing from, I'll let you say, one of the most prominent incubators in the startup space.
Yep. So, like, if you want to hear the history of Vue Storefront, so it started, I think, more than 3 years ago.
Yeah.
In an agency called Divante. So this is where we have started as an agency product, and we haven't got any, monetization strategy back then. The only monetization strategy was, okay, so let's sell projects on this, because we were in agency. It was pretty easy to do this. Then it got pretty popular because we're open source from the day zero, and other agencies were joining. People saw that this is solving their problems, and it got so popular to the degree that we saw it's too big for Divante, actually. That either we can make a product out of this, or we will lose this potential. So we spun out as our own thing, as VSF company. And shortly after that, we were backed by VC, Smog, and Movens. We got $1.5 million dollars of fund. And shortly after that, actually at the same day, when we have signed papers with our VC, we came back to our homes. And then we had a second call with YC. So we had the first call the day before, and we knew that sometimes if they need additional questions, they're asking you to have a second call. So we were prepared that, okay, so now that's another round of questions. When we came back home, we joined the call, and then Jared Friedman let us know that we are now backed by YC. So that was a crazy story. At the same day, we signed papers with our VC and joined YC.
Wow, that's exciting. What are some big sites that you can talk about that use Vue Storefront? And can you tell us a little bit about adoption?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our adoption actually grown very organically. So we had these huge deals that were coming from Divante because we were trying, to accelerate the growth and get the biggest clients possible. But at the same time, we had a community, and the community was adopting Vue Storefront for much smaller projects, but on the much bigger scale. So right now, I think we have more than 300 live shops. It is maybe even more right now. And among the biggest ones, I think there's Daily Whale, a pretty well-known fashion brand, international. There is also Zadig and Voltaire from France. So they're also selling luxury clothes. And right now, we entered a new space. So all of that was on Magento. And since this year, we are working closely with Commerce Tools as well. So Commerce Tools is actually targeting much bigger clients. So we have much bigger projects on the pipeline right now that soon will go live, but I can't tell about them yet.
Well, so I want to ask you, you probably already said this, but remind me, when did Vue Storefront development start? Like, when did you guys actually start the project?
Yeah, so it was 3 years ago, as far as I remember. Maybe a little bit more, but at the beginning it was a side project. So the first year, like, not that much happened during the first year. We're just adding features, asking people to join, etc. I think after the version 1.0, the traction started to be much bigger. We started to have much more partners. We started to appear on some conferences, and then it was like a snowball effect.
Because the reason I ask is I'm trying to place in the timeline of my memory when Vue, became more widely accepted. Vue's still pretty new. Like, what made you guys choose Vue over like a React or Angular or anything else out there?
So it's funny because at that time we actually have started on React, but so okay, let me give you a context. So 3 years ago, when anyone was thinking about headless e-commerce and about implementing this, they were not dedicated teams for that. They were not dedicated front-end developers for that. Usually there was a back-end developer, mostly working with PHP, Java, stuff like that, who happens to know a little bit of front-end. So React wasn't the best tool for them. It's a great framework, but it requires a lot of expertise to make things right. So we started with React so that it's not working very well, because we started implementing this with our backend developers. And then we thought, okay, so like what else could we choose? And at that time, there were two frameworks that were more like developer experience oriented. So there was Aurelia.js and Vue.js. And the funny thing is, my technical leader at that time was pushing me into the direction of Aurelia.js, which right now is like a huge niche, I think. So we chose Vue. It was a bet, but at the same time, I was pretty confident that this is solving our problems. I also fell in love with Vue at the first time I tried this, because previously I used to work with Angular.js, because there was no Angular 2 at that time. So it was a huge step forward in comparison to Angular.js. It took like the best parts from Angular and make them much easier to use. So I really like that. We started coding this, me and Piotr Karwatka, my former boss, and he was also a backend developer, and he also grabbed Vue just like this.
It's really interesting. Like, do you have like an anecdote or something that would be illustrative of where a developer struggled, like a backend developer struggled with React, that maybe surprised you or stood out and made you make that decision to look elsewhere?
Yeah, so like the biggest problem they had was actually productivity and best practices. So it wasn't intuitive enough to know how to do things right. While Vue is, I think it's much easier to do this, because for the very basic things and basic flows, there's usually just a single way of doing things, and the documentation is also very good. At that time, I think documentation was something that was standing out from the crowd in terms of Vue, why the React documentation wasn't that good. So, it all boils down to learning curve and adoption among less experienced developers. At that time, that was the group that we were targeting. But I think it's still a good choice considering our today's goals, because right now we are focusing on productivity, we are focusing on time to value, and Vue is also a great framework for that. But these days, the boundaries and differences between frameworks, they're not as much visible as a few years ago.
Got it.
So we had the guys, speaking of frameworks, we had the guys from Nuxt, the server-side rendering framework for Vue. And I know that originally you guys weren't using Nuxt, but you've made that transition to using it. Can you tell us like what the motivations were and what that process was like?
Yeah, so we were in contact with Nuxt guys, I think, from the very early days of Vue Storefront, and we were even talking about doing Vue Storefront in Nuxt. But at that time, Nuxt wasn't as much popular, and it wasn't a safe bet. It was a great framework, but at that time, it wasn't a safe bet. And since we were working in a big agency with enterprise customers, it was a risk. But over time, when we were building Vue Storefront, Nuxt was growing as well. And we also realized that we came to the point where actually any new feature that we were adding was inspired by Nuxt, because our users were demanding exactly the same functionalities, and we ended up building Nuxt by ourselves. We were even copying some of the APIs, because like, why should we invent that from scratch? So when we decided that we want to do a rewrite, which is Vue Storefront 2, formerly called Vue Storefront Next, the obvious choice was to use Nuxt.
So I know in VSF1, you used to have this elastic cache layer, and everything was based on that. And I think with VSF2, you've moved away from that. Could you like explain the lessons learned there and what happened?
Yes, so like in Vue Storefront 1, we started with Magento. So Devante, the agency that we were at that time, was mostly doing Magento. So of course we optimized mostly for Magento.
Yeah.
And the problem with Magento is that its APIs are pretty slow, especially when you have a big catalog. So we needed a way to overcome this. So what we did is we basically created our own API gateway but this API gateway has its own database. So we were taking all the products and like static data from the Magento to our own Elasticsearch database and querying this, and had synchronization. So whenever like we changed something in the admin panel, it was updating the products in our Elasticsearch, and all the dynamic calls were going directly to Magento. So this way we managed to overcome the slowness of Magento REST API on catalog. And with Vue Storefront Next, we are not focusing on Magento anymore. Vue Storefront Next is more like built to be adopted in any platform with the biggest level of like abstraction. And we started with commerce tools, and of course, like commerce tools is super fast. They're even guaranteeing the response times. So we didn't need that layer. We were able to directly call commerce tools. But of course, like for Vue Storefront Next for Magento, we actually still have to use this. We still have to use this.
So you still need Elasticsearch if you're doing Vue Storefront 2 on Magento.
Yes, but we changed it a little bit. So in Vue Storefront 1, Elasticsearch was a must, no matter what you had. And in Vue Storefront Next, even for Magento, this is an optional feature. So you can either directly call Magento GraphQL, or you can use Storefront API, which is like an evolution of Vue Storefront API. So the REST version was Vue Storefront API for Vue Storefront 1. For Vue Storefront Next, we have Vue Storefront API based on GraphQL. So this is an optional thing, an optional API gateway you could add to overcome the slowness, but this is not a must right now. So if you have a small product catalog, you're not making, you probably don't need that. But if you have a huge product catalog, or for some reason your catalog is slow, then you are free to use this. And this is basically a single line of code to change in the config.
So it's great that it's modular. The question I have, and the reason I'm curious, is I know Magento has their own PWA Studio. And so if the underlying APIs are slow, what do they do in say PWA Studio?
So as far as I know, it might change, but as far as I know, they are not doing anything specific. So they are also calling the GraphQL API directly. And I think they are more like counting on the third parties to manage that than doing this natively.
Interesting. I mean, so I remember, back when you guys, it was 3 years ago, right? PWAs were really, really new. And at least then, and I still think it's true today, Magento, is it safe to say, has, at least then, had the most vibrant headless ecosystem, right? There was you guys, there was I think Deity, there was a few others. Would it be safe to say, like, or let me ask you, who do you think as an e-commerce platform has the most vibrant headless ecosystem right now?
Yeah, I would say for sure Magento, because they started pretty early, but also Shopware. And of course, like my view could be biased because Shopware's headless PWA is based on Vue Storefront. But I also have a very good insights into this community. So of course, I'm not talking about platforms that are like natively headless, because they're obviously having the most vibrant community. So like commerce tools in there's actually no option to have it as a monolith. But when we are talking about the monolithic platforms that are right now shifting into the headless space, for sure this is Magento, for sure this is Shopware.
That makes sense. I mean, especially for Magento, there's kind of very developer-driven community, and it made a lot of sense that, especially 3 years ago, it was like the community that's doing PWAs the most is definitely the Magento folks. And so if somebody is using Magento and doing it either with Vue Storefront or PWA Studio, they're going to need to potentially use Elasticsearch if the catalog is large, basically.
So like as far as I know, the Elasticsearch right now is also a part of Magento. It is the enterprise version. I'm not sure how it is on the open source one. But being completely honest, I wasn't tracking the updates for like since the end of the last year, because we're so much flooded with work that I was just focusing mostly on just doing Vue Storefront.
Got it. I mean,
I know they're good.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are good things happening
Yeah.
in the Magento community, especially regarding performance, because it's becoming super, super important to everyone. They are for sure, approaching these problems from some angles, but I'm not sure like how they're doing this right now.
Got it. When I just take a step back and I think about, the operationalization or the so-called like day two, the maintenance of this, it sounds like you got to manage, you can have your Magento server, which is, PHP. You might have to worry now, it sounds like about Elastic, which is Java. And then if you're doing server-side rendering, you're gonna need Node server. It's just like the complexity of what you're gonna need to manage feels like it's getting more complex.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the issue of Vue Storefront 1 actually that we wanted to overcome. So we wanted Vue Storefront Next to be much simpler, and all the complexity, of course, sometimes it's necessary. Like there are reasons behind this. So all the additional complexity should be optional. So by default, you have the simplest possible setup. If something there is not working for you, we should provide you a tool that you can use and overcome this. So that's our strategy for Vue Storefront Next. In Vue Storefront 1, we thought that, okay, so that would be one size fits all, and it works for Magento, but it didn't work for everyone.
So maybe that's a good seg to what are like the popular hosting solutions for Vue Storefront? What are people commonly using to host and manage Vue Storefront along with their Magento or
Yeah,
whatever?
so of course, the first thing I want to mention is Vue Storefront Cloud. So we are hosting our like most demanding clients in our own cloud. We're providing them with SLAs, with additional integrations, and basically everything that they could need. So we are trying to provide them out of the box, and we are basing our cloud on Google Cloud. But as far as I know, especially for Vue Storefront 1, most of our clients were using AWS. Also, like the old version of Vue Storefront Cloud for Magento, we were using OVH. It's pretty well known, especially since I think last month when some of their servers got burnt.
I'm curious could you tell us why you picked, say, Google Cloud for, your underlying Storefront Cloud?
Yeah, so like we actually had a lot of discussions. At the beginning, we thought that we will choose AWS, mostly because that was kind of like a default for most of our clients in Vue Storefront 1. But then we also started talking with other vendors, and actually the Google Cloud offering, it sounds the most, we thought that we have the biggest match between and biggest similarities between Google Cloud and our approach, because first of all, Google is promoting performance. Google is promoting PWAs, so do we. Also, with AWS, there is a problem that it comes from Amazon, and Amazon is basically, their strategy is to kill shops because they are a marketplace, and
Amazon retail, you mean?
Yeah, and they want to conquer in this marketplace. So every shop that is actually not connected to Amazon and is not selling to Amazon is a competition for them. So that wasn't like the main reason why we did that, but we also thought about it in this way. But we chose Google Cloud mostly because it's aligned with what we believe in, and that they're very supportive, especially for startups.
Yeah, we've encountered that. We've been on ourselves used AWS for a long time, but we definitely have had clients, when we go through the procurement process where, if they're in e-commerce or retail, they view Amazon's e-commerce business as competitive, and they don't want to be funneling any money to the same organization. So I've heard that before as well. What are the, most popular e-commerce platforms as a backend to Vue Storefront? I think we've mentioned a few of them, like Magento, Commerce Tools, Shopware. Do you have a sense of what the percentage breakdown is between those and what some of the other platforms?
Yeah, so I would say like majority, like 90% or something like this, is on Magento, because this is where we were for the most of the time. Right now, we are entering Commerce Tools, and I think it's safe to say that most of the new Commerce Tools projects will be handled with Vue Storefront. So I also expect a huge growth in this sector. And there is also Shopware, where it's still young and Shopper PWA is still a young project, not like it. There are production stuff with that. One of them actually won on AWW Awards. It's Vintage Area. They have amazing design, very like innovative, I would say, and creative. But it's not ready yet for this huge adoption. But at the same time, Shopper is a platform which has, I think they have like 100,000 shops, something like this in total, including Shopware 5. So I would expect that Shopware will probably very quickly surpass Magento and Commerce Tools in terms of like number of installations. When we are talking about the size of a client, then Commerce Tools wins for sure. But right now, like the sweet spot between those is Magento. So we have, when we are talking about the projects that are live, we have the biggest clients on Magento and also the biggest amount of projects on Magento.
Interesting. And then, of course, when you go headless or composable commerce, there are other pieces to the puzzle. So like in terms of CMSs or search and payments, what are like the popular other tools that you guys are encountering that people integrate Vue Storefront with?
I think that's a pretty standard setup. So like when we are talking about payments, so no, it's always things like agent are popping out. Recently, we started working with checkout.com, which is also a very interesting platform, and they got insane funding. I think it was in total something like 450 millions or something like this. So really insane funding, and they have a pretty neat idea of basically having lambdas that are handling payments. So when you're making an integration on the front end, you're talking only to this lambda, and you really like, in theory, you don't care what backend platform is behind this. The reality is a little bit different, but I think like they are just starting, and what matters to me is the idea and the vision. So we really like that, and we are cooperating with them pretty closely. Regarding searches, of course, Algolia, of course, Bloomreach. So these are the two most popular right now. Previously, we also worked a little bit with Constructor.io. So they aren't that much popular. They are focused on AI search and personalization.
Oh, interesting.
And that would be about searches. And for CMSs, this is also pretty standard. So of course there are like this huge ones like Content Stack, like Appliance, but also there are some smaller players like Storyblock. So Storyblock is actually the one that is most aligned with our mindset, because they also believe in open source. They also have a huge community. They are also heavily investing in the Vue.js community. So whenever we see a popular Vue.js project, there's a huge chance that Storyblock is already supporting them. Also, there are some new CMSs that actually came to us and created amazing integrations, and I think there's a lot of potential in them. For example, Lexas CMS. So Lexas CMS is basically a CMS focused on e-commerce and personalization. So they are pretty young. They're still lacking some features that others have, but they also have a great vision on making this personalization happen. And if they will succeed with what they want, I think they will be very well-known player on the market.
Oh, interesting. I have to check them out.
So we talked a lot about speed, Elasticsearch, Google as a backend. One of the things that's emerged in the last, year or so is Jamstack as a way to mitigate slow APIs, specifically exporting your app as a static site so that it doesn't have to connect to a backend. Is that something that is common in the Vue Storefront community? Do you see a lot of demand for that yet?
Yeah, so actually I'm pretty surprised, because I don't think I see a lot of demand and a lot of questions, even though this is kind of like an obvious way to improve the performance. And I think like the issue is probably evangelization and treating this as like kind of like a default way of using it. But like, I don't see a huge demand, but I also see that actually the adoption and demand is rising. It's not, it's still not the default choice for most of our customers, but I would expect that to change like even in months, because we actually see a rise of Jamstack in the e-commerce space from the last year. So it's still growing, like as well as headless, right?
Do you have a sense for like what's the right size for a site, maybe in terms of SKUs or products for static sites versus fully dynamic?
I wouldn't say that there are any limitations in terms of like the size of the product catalog. I would say maybe complexity would be something, and personalizations would be a good indicators that maybe it is not for you. So if you have a lot of personalized content that cannot be cached and served statically, perhaps it's better to not do this.
Yeah, that's a
But
great
I know
point.
that there are solutions that are actually allowing you to do like this edge rendering. So you're rendering only the part that is not personalized, then injecting the personalized content into this. Like, I think Uniform is doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Stitching it together at the edge. That's interesting. So on the front end performance front, like how aware are your developers or your like people in your community of Core Web Vitals? And is there anything that Vue Storefront can do to help improve a site's Core Web Vitals score, or is that largely up to the implementer?
So like what we are providing out of the box is obviously like a pretty well optimized template. We also, like in Vue Storefront 1, it was a huge problem because we had a very well optimized template out of the box, but whenever a client was coming, they could ruin all these micro optimizations with a single JavaScript library. And this is actually what was happening. And in the end, the funny thing was we weren't able to find a good case studies for our clients, except like maybe few projects that were done under our supervision, because it was so common for everyone to throw like megabytes of JavaScript on the front end, because there's like kind of like a misconception that if you're doing headless and if you're doing single page applications, it means that the whole business logic should be on the front end side. And it's definitely not like this, especially like when you're talking about mobile devices where, like executing JavaScript could be 10 times, sometimes 100 times slower. So in Vue Storefront Next, we wanted to make it kind of like, we wanted to overcome this limitation. We wanted to find a solution. So in Vue Storefront Next, we actually have a middleware, but it's not the typical middleware, because usually you have a middleware to orchestrate the data. And it can be used this way as well. But the primary reason why we added this middleware was to keep the extendability system, the integrations code, and all the business logic on the server side. So the client side is only handling the UI. So we kind of like, if you're following the good practices, the best practices, and if you're doing everything in a way that we are recommending, shouldn't have issues with performance. Of course, you can't have a platform that is allowing like limitless flexibility and at the same time is guaranteeing anything. But we're trying to find this balance. And of course, out of the box, everything is pretty well optimized. But it's, it still won't prevent anyone from throwing like a 3 megabyte JavaScript on the initial load.
Yeah, just import Star from Lodash and everything will be faster.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
exactly.
let marketing go crazy with the tag manager.
Yeah. What's one more tag amongst friends?
Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, because you asked about the Core Web Vitals as well. So, like, we are very aware of that. Our customers are very aware of that. Developers are very aware of that. Everyone are very aware of that. Everything is beautiful except one thing. No one really knows how to interpret Core Web Vitals. I mean, there are a few people who know, but generally speaking, whenever we talk to any clients, they totally don't get how to do this, especially when we're talking about this in a context of Lighthouse score. So that's probably the most misleading thing that Google introduced ever, really, because, from the one point of view, that's an amazing tool because it boils down the whole performance into a single number. But that's also the reason why it's bad, because you can't boil down the performance to a single number, even if it has proper ways. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the business people totally don't get how to interpret that. And they are like, I will give you an example of one of the clients that we had. And this is not a single situation. It happens regularly, maybe not to that degree, but very similarly. So we had a client and they were migrating from Magento to Vue Storefront. And at that time, they did some benchmarks with Lighthouse. Now they moved to Vue Storefront. And after, I think, 1.5 years with Vue Storefront, they decided, okay, we are now migrating to different platform, but we don't want to use Vue Storefront anymore. And we are asking, like, why you don't want to use Vue Storefront anymore? Because it's slower. So I did some benchmarking, of course, I checked that. And I talked with those guys, also Google talked with those guys. And the situation looks like this. They are always looking at the Lighthouse score as a number. So this number was higher when they were benchmarking this like 2 years ago, and right now it's lower. So obviously they think that the performance is worse. Another thing is that they are using the lab data, not the field data. If you look at the field data and compare it against like Adidas or Nike, it's actually performing better than Adidas and Nike. But the score is like around, I don't know, it was something around 12.
Yeah, that's not surprising. Like that exactly mirrors what I've seen, where the lab data and the field data might be wildly different. And then in the last 2 years, especially, the way that Lighthouse formulates the score has really changed. It's gone much more towards front end. And like kind of ironically, you know, there's the front end component of Core Web Vitals is very different. It's actually not really performance oriented. It's more experience oriented with CLS and FID, which is normally a problem. So there's stuff coming and going all different directions. And in the end, you know, you got that one number up at the top, which is like this year's score, but that's not actually the number that Google ranks you by. So it's, yeah, you're right. It's a total mess.
Yeah, exactly. Especially that, you know, 2 years ago, almost every page was scoring around 90. And right now it's almost impossible to score 90 when you have, you know, when you have a pretty complex website. Also, what clients don't get is that you don't, like, 100 is not the goal. 100 is actually the goal when you have a very simple website, but performance is and features, you know, they are going in the opposite directions. So we always need to find the balance between features and between performance. If you have a very complex website that is scoring, let's say, 60, and that's a good score. If you have a very simple blog that is scoring 60, that's a very bad score. So, you know, things are not white or black in here. And I think like what we're missing right now is evangelization, how to interpret those scores, what things are important for the business, what things are not important for the business, because the lab test is basically only relevant for developers when you want to check like, okay, so this is how it was, this is how it is, and it's better right now. I think that's like the only use case for that. Maybe also to see, okay, so maybe some of the metrics are obviously exceeding the recommended scores, but basically like the only thing that should matter to business is field data, and if field data is good, then everyone should be happy.
Yeah, I like how you put that.
That's one of the toughest things there, you know, with Lighthouse, because it's a calculated score, so it's kind of subjective, and so if the formula changes over time, there's no way of studying your performance longitudinally. At least with Core Web Vitals, you know, it's just seconds. Layout shift is a little bit more abstract, but you know, at least first input delay today will be the same thing as first input delay 2 years from now. It's just milliseconds.
Yeah, exactly. And if you take, you know, if you go to the page speed insights, and if you benchmark the top websites like Nike, AliExpress, Adidas, all of that sort, you will see that the score actually is low for all of them, but the field data is rather high. And this is why they're not optimizing further, because they don't need that. They are already satisfying their customers with a good performance. So there's no point in, you know, optimizing for 100, and there's no like benefit from that if majority of your users is still getting a good performance. And also, you know, performance also has to be put it in a context. So if majority of your customers, if you're selling luxury goods, you could expect your customers to have a better devices. Then performance is a little bit less important. Maybe you can put a little bit more features. Maybe the analytics and, you know, tracking user behavior would be much more beneficial for you than optimizing like loading time a little bit if most of your users is still using the the latest iPhone. But if you have users that are using mid-range phones, low-end phones, then it's becoming super important because they could easily get frustrated. Their phones could hang. Also, the network connectivity is not always so good. So like, there are so many variables in there that saying that, whenever you see a low score and saying that this is a bad score, it's
not the whole
it's
story.
a major misconception.
Yeah, it has a lot of confounders. The one piece of bad news I'm gonna disagree with is this whole thing about like scores changing over a year, like the Lighthouse score keeps getting revised. They've said that they're gonna revisit the Core Vital score every year. So I feel like we're still gonna be playing a dance a little bit.
It's like ECMAScript, we're gonna have CWV 2022, 2023.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's probably what's gonna happen. Well, we're actually at time, but just to wrap up here, what are you most excited about, or what should our listeners be most excited about that's on the coming roadmap for Vue Storefront?
Yeah, so like obviously the thing that I'm excited the most about is the official launch of Vue Storefront Next. So we actually, it's on our GitHub for more than a year, but this is how we work. We are pushing things out very, very early, even if they are not even on the beta phase. So everyone can get familiar with that. They can give us feedback, etc. But 20th of April is the day when we are hosting Vue Storefront Summit. So this is the first ever conference that we as Vue Storefront are doing, and we already have 19 speakers from different backgrounds, different tech vendors talking about their integrations with Vue Storefront, people from our community talking about different parts of the ecosystem. So this is super, super, super exciting to me. And there we want to announce, it's not a secret, there we want to announce that Vue Storefront Next is finally ready to use.
Awesome.
So,
where should people go to sign up for the summit?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way is to go to our website, vuestorefront.io, and at the top you will have a link where you can sign into Vue Storefront Summit. It's free for everyone. So if you could join.
Great. And then if people want to try it out, I assume they go to vuestorefront.io and click it on.
Yeah, so we have a Vue Storefront CLI, basically a single command to install the CLI, another command to set up a project, and then you can try it out.
Okay. And then if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to reach you?
I suggest reaching me out on Twitter. I'm pretty addicted to it, so I'm answering very fast. My handle is Filip Rakowski. Also, you can find me on our community Slack on Vue Storefront, so slack.vuestorefront.io. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for joining us on JavaScript Jam. Thank you so much. It was great talking with you, really. Same here. See you later. Thank you.